Hey, thanks everyone. Thanks for Stitch Fix for hosting us and for everyone showing up. I wish I would have had this. I was learning how to be an engineering manager, just like many of you probably have got started. I found a group of like 5 friends, and we'd go to the Old Pro in Palo Alto and basically have a beer and like cry with each other all the time. So now we have a beer and like talk about good stuff too. So this was a long journey, and I think everyone who's here kind of knows the notion of engineers. I love Silicon Valley, as everyone here probably watches it, and you can learn a lot about engineering management, of course, by being there. But obviously, a lot of you came from an engineering background. A lot of you know what the personality types are like, and I think the empathy of that side helps you be a good manager. So I kind of went through a path just to give you a flavor for what happened. You know, I was an individual engineer after graduate school, going into Silicon Graphics. No one knows about them anymore, which is also a good lesson. I was one-person individual contributor. Then I went to another company called Transmeta, raised the most money of all time only to collapse in the dot-com era. It was a very interesting time, and that was when I personally said, I kind of like this leadership thing. I got to run a project, started to take on more people, and ran about a 10-person group there, and then moved up to about a 100-person, then a 200-person group, and realized very rapidly, super different job at each number, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then after that, I went to VMware and started with a group of 20, and then it became a group of 200, and then 500, and then 3,000. And it's a very, very different job at each side. And when Jerry said, do you have a chance to come share of the learnings or the things that you screwed up along the way, I had to like cut it way down to like a 30-minute talk. So I'll be careful with that. Today I'm a venture capitalist, and I focus purely on very technical infrastructure type of companies, and I always filter based on engineering teams. So it's just what I know and what I like. And it's very fun to be able to do the mentoring and evaluation that way. So happy to chat about that later if anyone's interested. So kind of just go through kind of a fun talk, give you a couple of very specific things that you can take away and maybe use in your own way. I was told, someone thought I had Walter White as like my engineer. That's a hipster, if you're wondering. What I wanted to focus on, though, is very specifically where I looked at the background of a lot of people here, some very large companies, some smaller, but mostly trying to focus on the growth of 3 to 30 people, which is a very specific type of thing. I think, Jason, you're going to cover organization, scaling, even beyond that. So hopefully between the two, you'll get a lot of different flavors for what goes on. And so again, the goal here is some very specific and pragmatic actions that at least I took along the way that I thought were pretty useful, and hopefully you will. So first of all, it always starts with getting people on board. You see everyone needing to do different ways to recruit and events like this or anything. So it usually starts with a friend. Those of you that have been at the startup, you kind of get accidentally pulled together with a couple of people. Hopefully things go a little bit well, maybe you get a little bit of seed funding or something like that, or maybe you're at a larger company and you're doing well enough that someone says, hey, you should probably do more work, so you need to find more people and get going with it. So what I think is really interesting is, first of all, is realizing how much is needed and then the pace at which you're doing that. I'm going to skip a lot of that and really just talk about the type of people that we tried to look for and the type of interviewing skills and type of events that we tried to do along the way. And so I picked a fictional character, Jordan. This is an engineer you might recognize in some way. Maybe this one works very late, hates to read email. Maybe this is tabs versus spaces, I don't know. But this happens to be a person we'll refer to that focused a little bit more on elegance and like really making sure that the code is going to be long time and sustainable versus someone who's just the fastest hacker and they're going to get something running. So this becomes relevant in a little bit in how you build out a team and teach them. But so I think when you're trying to find great employees, a lot of you have done the traditional tricks or moves. Every company on earth has some referral bonus because everyone knows someone you know is a good person to bring in. Everyone on earth hires some kind of recruiter or puts some kind of recruiting staff behind them. Maybe 3 types of approaches that we found over time worked out really well that you might consider. The first one was really around doing interesting events. And probably the biggest problem I always had is I'd go up to the great engineers and I'd say, hey, who's the best person you ever worked with? And their response would be, oh, it's this guy Billy, but there's no way on earth he's ever going to leave the company, so we shouldn't even try, and I don't want to bug him. So that would be like a pretty typical response. And so one suggestion I have for everyone is think about just a really cool event that you have that is about some interesting topic, and it is not a recruiting event whatsoever. Invite everyone that you know. In fact, require that everyone invite a couple of people there. And worst case, we used to do these things where it was actually musicians who would show their work or artists that would show their work. In the worst case, you've done a cool event and more people have heard about your company. In the medium good case, they will in turn know something and refer a friend because they've heard something about this company. And in the best case, and this happened all the time, is that previously untouchable candidate became an actual candidate. So this is kind of obvious, but the point is make an event that is generally interesting. It's not about just recruiting, and then have the people show up and learn a bit more. The other things that might be a little interesting that you might not have done before. So one is we were trying to do pretty low-level software programming, and so a lot of it was trying to hire really techie things. And as you know, a lot of folks are really focused on hard problems, and that's how you can attract them there. We actually, one thing I did about maybe a year and a half in, everyone pays for patents, or at least most companies give you some bonus if you do a disclosure of a patent. We started paying for getting a paper into a referee conference of any time, and of course paid for the people to go there. And it was actually somewhat controversial early on, and this is when we're a small company with tight schedules and not enough resources. But I found probably over time about 20% of our top employees came through these circles, and it was really just by being out there and talking to people in a very technical way about your problems and getting them going. So I would just suggest, if you have the chance, it's so hard to pull people off of the projects that they're working on, but doing things like these conferences definitely paid off in quite a few cases. And this is pretty popular now in open source projects as the other way, but at the time this wasn't quite as massive. In fact, Transmeta is where Linus Torvalds worked, and that was the first time I ever heard about open source. But I would just say the other thing that's, again, pretty obvious now is not only doing your own open source projects, but actually sponsoring them, and obviously, especially with GitHub and things, you can really see who are really good employees and good contributors on the code front. And so very aggressive sponsorship, even at the smallest startup at this stage of open source projects that are somewhat relevant, has been a really good move on the hiring front. So good source of hiring, ultimately a very good source of job satisfaction too. Everyone likes to talk about the work they do in a conference or in an open source world. Next thing, interviewing. So I think a lot of you that came from engineering backgrounds in particular, engineers in general are a little more introverted and don't like to be right in front of everybody pushing hard on questions. I'll just give one thing that I really learned. I did 1 million interviews. We did the standard thing where we had 5 people line up, try and go in and give interviews. Some people are good at it, some people are terrible at it. They repeated the same questions at least a few times. Now, you get to the end of the day, you do your round table, and you find out whoever's the loudest speaker tends to either blackball or let a candidate through. So it's just kind of miserable, to be honest. And I hope none of you do it exactly like that, but we did it for many, many years that way. The only takeaway I'd love you to consider and try if you don't do it is only do team interviewing. And we moved from a world where we were doing individual interviews back to back to putting 2 or sometimes 3 people in the same room. And the outcomes are kind of interesting. First of all, I think everyone becomes a better interviewer when they actually see someone else. I definitely know if you're a little more timid, you get emboldened by someone next to you to ask the hard question or to push a little bit deeper. Certainly, I think you do that more in person with someone else than you do by yourself. So I think the quality of the questions gets a bit better. I think it's less exhausting for the interviewers themselves too. It's hard to be on and asking the questions the whole time. The interviewee is going to be exhausted, but the interviewers are not as tired. And then again, I think you get far less repeated questions for the interviewers. At the end of the day, the ultimate time spent with the interview candidate, I think, could be substantially less. But I do think the end result we saw time and time again was a much better feel for things, and multiple people hearing the same answer, certainly giving different analysis of it. So I thought that was something that worked extremely well. The other thing, again, I don't know, how many of you maybe just show of hands, do a standard whiteboarding session with people as part of your interview? Sort of do bubble sort or do something like that. If they use it go-to, don't hire them. That's probably a good initial statement. But I would just say one other thing that we've tried, and probably a number of you do this now as well, is actually turning the interviews into working sessions. And this is extremely hard to do and actually puts a big onus on the manager itself. But the 2 most effective ways I've seen how a person is going to fit into an environment and actually work is putting them directly into a co-programming environment very quickly. So very specifically, we'll try to do one of 2 things. One is pick up a bug, and you have to spend a lot of time picking a bug that's at least manageable. And really just sitting down, literally sharing a keyboard with the person and saying, how would you go about doing this? And it's very hard to pick the problem because they don't know the domain, they don't know this spaghetti code that you have going on here. But you can learn a ton about someone purely by how they begin to ask the questions and begin to reason about things. So I think I can talk more about that later if you like, but consider, are there some bugs that you can look at together and see how they would think about it. And the other side of that is, I've seen a couple of companies do this very well, which is actually picking a story from a Scrum and really spending the time to ask them ahead of time to look at the product and understand the product, but when they actually get there, think about how they would go through the programming process here. And again, the hardest thing about this is selecting the right type of problem that's not too esoteric. But I guarantee when you go through this, The end result is a much more realistic assessment of what it's like to work with a person. And again, if they get totally frustrated, if they grab the keyboard from you, if they do whatever, I think it ends up being kind of telling. And in the worst case, you don't hire them and you probably made some progress on a bug or a scrum. So that's pretty good as well. Next thing, I'm just rapidly firing through a bunch of little tricks. So this is the Power of Interns. That's a cute little hipster intern. I love that. Anyway, one thing that I found also, especially for startups, interns were the lifesaver for all of VMware. So we had 450 interns the last summer I was there. And the idea here is obvious on a bunch of fronts. Like, this is a way that you're going to build your pipeline for future employees. But I'll posit there are a couple of things that are even more important than that. One is a mandatory assignment of a senior engineer as the mentor for an intern. And the ability to begin to get empathy skills and understanding what it means to communicate and to begin to actually be responsible for someone, as we'll talk about later, that is one of the best ways to possibly see if you have other management candidates in your technical team. It is hugely fun to watch someone who is usually yelling at you be yelled at by their intern. So I think that's really cool. Secondly is, I think what's really great about interns, they come in with no baggage of meetings and things like that. So we would just dole out a long list of collected productivity tools and basically just things that they could come in and make a lot of progress on. So in terms of actually generating code that would be used very quickly and actually be leveraged by others, that was a fantastic way to do it. And then lastly, we, especially maybe we're a little bit older, stodgier company in some ways, but just constantly bringing in people that are using the newest languages and tools and having new viewpoints on what is a good user experience. Just the pure feedback on how we were doing things was constantly important. So I can't emphasize enough, like, this was by far the best thing we did, is just a massive, massive intern program. But I would say even if you're a small company, start with one. Just really get that going early on, and I think you'll gain quite a bit. So cruising right along, what we actually need to do, actually like this one as well. I love Silicon Valley. So now let's assume you have a reasonable team in place and you've got Jordan and a few other people. You have a pretty good product concept and you have a team of devs that are cranking out code. What could possibly go wrong? What I found that I was spending most of my time on as an engineering manager at all different levels was ultimately a prioritization problem. And it was prioritization of obviously getting the work done, which was what we're paid for, but it was also how do you prioritize all the other stuff that you just have to do. And I think ultimately the job of engineering manager is like constant triage. And it's triage of how do you keep your engineers happy. It's a triage around how do I satisfy most of these product things, how do I keep my code base clean, all these different things. And so I always had a lot of problems with this, and it's very stressful when you don't know how you can balance these trade-offs. So I wanted to talk about specifically 3 things that we learned over time that I thought were pretty useful. One is how do you continue to deliver cool new things amidst just the constant P0, P1 bug fixes that you have to do. Second one was the biggest deal, especially as your company gets older, is like you have all this code, everyone knows it needs to be rewritten, people hate working on it, they're slow. Like, how do you deal with that? And the last one is just tooling, which is another pet topic that I like quite a bit. So let me just give, again, a couple of real specific anecdotes. So delivering innovation, again, once you get to bigger companies especially, it's very easy to fall in the trap of just constant maintenance of these releases and trying to keep them alive. And obviously, if you have great engineers in staff, they want to do interesting new things at the same time. So, yeah, I think that the obvious things I would say is that good product managers are awesome, and they live with products. They live with the customers. They know what's important. They know what will sell. They know what's a competitive feature. Usually pretty good at bucketing and turning them into sort of P0 features. And for advanced credit, really good product managers know how much work there is and what trade-offs and what risks there are of including them in a release. So that's all great. The biggest problem is that they just can't know what's possible engineering-wise, and the products and the customers don't know that they want. So here's one thing we did. So a PRD in our world was probably similar to what a lot of people's was, or at least in a Scrum world, it's a little bit different. But so we very explicitly said that we're going to allow 15% of all product releases to include features that product managers don't want. And that sounds kind of negative, but it really was. It was basically a combination of engineers coming up with crowdsourcing of what are things that we can do that would be really cool that we think might be useful, basically voting on it and then making sure there was allocation in the release for doing it. So explicitly having a PRD room for this thing and not having it being driven, having it driven from the engineering side worked out pretty well. The other thing that happened, I personally was given a part of my bonus was for shipping delightful things that nobody explicitly wanted. And that's super hard, and like scheduling when you're going to give innovation is like, I used to get asked like, when will the next big innovation show up? That's like one of the harder things to answer. But I would just say, really making it something that you're held accountable for and that you understand the trade-offs there is something that plays off pretty well. And then we'll talk about this in hygiene as well, but leaving it up to the engineering team to actually be able to have a real debate over which of these trade-offs is very different from everyone complaining that their thing isn't getting in. The other thing I would just say, again, this is more enterprise software these days. The shipment speed is much different than for what we were doing. But I would just say finding alternate release paths so people could put interesting things out there became very important. Again, more of a stodgy enterprise company that people really focused on. Created the notion of flings, which were just unsupported quick release tools that made a lot of engineers super famous for tons of people using it. Let them sort of get their itch about wanting to get something out the door. And many times the people looked at it and said, it's crap, I'm never going to use it. So it saved time from getting into the release. But whatever your company looks like, the idea that you can create some type of path for getting these release things out in a much lighter weight way, where the traditional problem is you don't have QA for it, you don't have support for it, all the excuses for why you don't want to put something out that hasn't gone through the process. But whatever it makes sense for you, find these alternate release paths and consider really using that as part of how your engineers get better products out there, get happier, and ultimately help customers as well. So the other thing that you constantly, this is a very scientific graph as well, the navel-gazing continuum. The other thing that is a common challenge you always hear about in engineering teams is, should I do a quick hack? Should I get this thing out the door? Or should I actually do this right? And should I make this the perfect algorithm that's going to scale perfectly and is going to have modularity and APIs that are perfect? So, I would just say one of the biggest challenges I constantly had was different people with very different opinions on this, and constantly trying to make this trade-off in the face of a release schedule. And for me, the biggest frustration was a few years in, some of the people that really loved engineering code that was very elegant would just quit. They'd just say, I hate it, I can't make any progress on this code anymore. It takes me 18 months to make progress, and by the way, it's too risky anyway. So all of you have had this in some kind of way and had to deal with some type of trade-off. I would just say you need both of these things at all times. You need to be able to do both of them, but you can actually put a little rigor into how you deal with it. And I'm going to put this in the context of greater issue of sort of architectural hygiene. This is not a problem when you're getting up to your 1.0 product, or actually sometimes it is, but it's really a product that you're getting going a little bit further. How do I take the time to make my product scalable, modular, more readable, change languages that it's written in, all these things that you deal with. And the constant frustration I bet a lot of you here have had is like, I never have time to do this. There's no chance, my engineers hate me, my product is too late. So I ended up coming up with something that I thought was kind of crazy at the time, but it actually worked pretty well. And just like the innovation piece where you allocate a little bit of time in a PRD for this, we made a rule that said, and I forgot what the exact number was, call it 15% of the total release is allocated 100% to architectural hygiene. And that ended up translating into kind of amount of people or amount of code change, whatever metric we were using there. But the key two things we did here, one was we actually assigned a product manager to it. And this is the last thing any of them really cared about, is like architectural readability and modularity that doesn't affect the customer. But we actually pulled them in to get empathy and understanding of why this mattered so much in the long term for both development of engineers as well as productivity and writing code. So the first thing we did was say, we are dedicating in every single release some chunk of resource to it. The fun part though became where we then had people choose what it was going to be and when. And this became really, really interesting. We gave this over 100% to our senior engineering, we had a set of engineers at a certain level, and they were put into a room and said, you are in charge of looking across all the modules and prioritizing both which ones are going to be addressed at what time, and then how you're going to address them. And the fights for doing this were outrageous. Like, it was basically, this sucks more than that, was kind of the debate. But what ultimately came out was a roadmap of when we're going to rewrite certain modules of a pretty big code base. And at first I didn't kind of get why that mattered so much, but it mattered in ways that I couldn't even fathom. The first is, I had a lot of engineers who refused to touch crappy code because they would just say, I'm not going to do a hack. We're never going to fix it otherwise. But if they saw that, hey, 3 releases from now is the major rewrite of this whatever file system, the ability to do quick hacks and really be supportive of doing them changed dramatically. And on the flip side, there was hope. It's like, one day this actually will be good code. And so when you do it that way, I really think, again, it's going to apply differently to your different companies and your different situations, but really having a roadmap and knowing that it's not always going to be this mess will go a really long way. I think at the end of the day, we were able to bring in new engineers and actually even tell them, hey, you're going to work on this hacked up version here, and in parallel, we're going to be working on the next release there. I will say the other benefits, the benefits around the technical debates were fantastic too. Just listening to engineers say which code needs to be rewritten and why the fastest. When you totally hand it off to them and to have this responsibility for choosing that, it's very different from what was often the case of all of them complaining about everything to someone else. This really made it become a very good technical debate. So of all the things I did, and again, this is over many years doing this was the one that actually made the biggest game changer in terms of product and in terms of engineers in the long term. So put architectural hygiene in a PRD, allocate a PM so they understand why you would make these trade-offs, and then have engineers decide what and when these changes happen. Put it in the PRD. So last thing I'll call it is also pretty obvious. Investing in tooling, a lot of people talk about this. It's very hard to do though. There's tons of practices these days with CI and CD tools and test coverage analysis, all that you all know very well. I'll just say three specific tips that I would call it here that probably were more unique. One is we actually had the rule if you actually did something 3 times, automate it. Kind of obvious, but we'd actually call people out on this pretty often. It never worked exactly as well as it sounds on stage, but that was the rule. So try to automate things, obviously. But more importantly, we were obsessed with code reviews from day one. We actually made it a requirement for any check-in that someone else signed on the code. Everyone has read the studies that this is the single best way to avoid bugs getting in later on. It obviously has benefits around the hit by a bus factor, so at least someone else is somewhat familiar with your code. But I also found it ended up being just a really good mentoring way as well. When people had to sit down and explain their code, it ended up working out quite well on that front. And then the last thing, you might wonder what that icon is. We used to have all these policies that we'd create. As we get closer to release time, it's like beta 2, you have to have 3 reviewers of every check-in before you do it, or you have to run 73 tests instead of 71. And we used to have a TGIF party, but it was on Thursdays. So we'd have a drinking party every Thursday, and we'd say, never check in after the drinking party. And sure enough, people would check it in and break the build, and everything would happen. So the point in this case is we had all these verbal things, and we'd hold the managers responsible for telling everyone to do it. And at one point, all the engineers just hacked it straight into our GitHub equivalent at the time, and really making sure that every policy around what you're trying to do gets into tools instead of into managers. Yeah, it sounds obvious. I spent so much time sending out mail on what the latest rule was or the latest process was that this was a big game changer for me. And I'll lastly call out, all of this tooling stuff came through interns. Almost every single time we kept a running list of the best tool changes on earth, and they ended up being really good things for them to do. We used hackathons, spot bonuses, those things as well.
Can you give me an example of you implementing tooling where you rely on the tooling versus the engineering managers?
Yeah, the question was an explicit example of how you would rely on that. It was actually my party example was one. So we used to say we wouldn't allow any check-ins after 5 p.m. on Thursday evenings because it happened to be a time when everyone was messing up. So we actually explicitly forbid via Git from actually making check-ins. That was one, but more importantly, like the more common thing was as you get closer to a release and you're tightening the screws a little bit, it was requiring sign-off from extra people and putting that in your check-in code. It required actually putting in a key that showed you had run a certain test. So it was just things that would enforce those processes.
Thank you.
Cool, so all right, we've hired a good team. We've figured out how to do some code and architectural hygiene. Now what do we do about the people side? And that's probably why a lot of you are here today is like, what is the people side of this and how do we develop and how do we retain people when appropriate? So here comes another scientific chart. So everyone has dealt with this chart before with an engineer if you've been in engineering management. So it is the most productive engineer on earth, brilliant, can put out code everywhere, but is in some way actively detrimental. And everyone's had some way of doing this. I had 2 very specific examples, and I've changed their names, but I had someone named Paul who had, and this is a little embarrassing, but like the worst body odor on earth. And no one refused to sit in an office with him. The other person was Pat, and Pat called everyone a nitwit in the check-ins and actually would change their code and check it in without telling them. So these 2 people different problems, different challenges, and got lots of complaints on them. I'm not going to give you any particular way that you deal with them. I would just say what I had to do was draw a very specific red line. For me, it was when they are being actively disrespectful to a person after 2 warnings, and that actually became mine. But I think the main point here is find your hard line on what is acceptable and just be super consistent. Later I could tell you plenty of stories on people that were great that we had to let go. And the last thing I want to talk about here is really what I think is the most important part about developing engineers, as well as making them become potentially your replacement, your augmentation. And this is, I think Jason might even talk about how this helps you scale, but the power of empathy is something that was super important for almost every engineer we brought in. And this applies in a bunch of different ways. You want a great engineer to have empathy for what it means to be a manager, what it means to be a customer, and what it means to be someone else working at the company. A couple of very specific things. A lot of people do this. The first thing you had to do as an engineer was sit on the phone and take support calls. That's a very common thing. It worked out very well. The second thing we required was for any promotion that you actually had to go on site to a customer and sit with them for 4 hours and basically listen to how things work there. But the last one we did, I just threw this one out as a really cool tool. I don't know how many of you directly own bug triage, but that's like one of the common challenges for engineering manager is all this crud coming in at you and you're the one in charge of assigning it to everyone else. I got so tired of doing this and couldn't do it well either that we just created a rotation for the bug guru, as we call it. And their job was nothing more than for 1 week to be in charge of watching all the bugs coming in and doing what it takes to assign them to the right people. We got on for a long time about this. This led the engineers to actually create support tools to have better understanding on how things work in the whole system context, to really get mad when they were checking in something they thought would turn into a bug later, and it also saved me a lot of time. So I think that the notion that you can get empathy in a bunch of different ways is the main point here. Last thing I'm going to call out, and I will, I guess, open it for just a couple minutes, is the use of status reports. And some people think they're the lamest thing on earth, and they can be, and especially when you're just giving information and trying to show that you did a lot of good work. I actually challenged all the engineers in my group to do pretty exhaustive work around just 2 things. Tell me what you think you're going to work on next week, and then at the end of the week, tell me what you actually worked on the previous week. And it was partly informative and partly useful for me, but more important than anything else, this got the engineers themselves to really understand what it actually took to develop what they wanted to do. Really get a better understanding of the time frame. And ultimately, I found the people that adjusted and got the best understanding of what would really happen with time, very strong correlation with those that would ultimately become really good engineering managers. And so in the end, that was kind of just a couple of the trips that we did along the way to getting a lot of our engineers to become managers. So I know that's very rapid fire, just a lot of very specific tips and tools along the way. There's a lot of stories behind each of them. I'd be happy to share more. But do we have a minute for questions, or you want to just move?
Yeah, we have 5 minutes for it.
Okay, great. So maybe I'll just open up to a few questions.
Regarding your status report, well, first of all, are your teams work on the agile method at all?
At the time, I was half agile and half a more waterfall model.
Waterfall, okay. Because I know that in the waterfall model, excuse me, when you move from sprint to sprint, you know what people actually worked on in the previous sprint and what they have planned for the next sprint, so actually save time producing status reports because it's already included.
Yeah, I would just say you're totally right, and you know, things also apply in a lot of different ways. There's so much stuff that's going on outside of just the core, stories and Scrum work too, whether it's mentoring people or meetings or actually trying to meet with the customer or helping on certain bugs. I think that's probably where it became a bit more useful. But even, a lot of you do these different ways, but even at the end of a Scrum, a lot of people looking back at what their plan was and how it did that. I think the main point is to have this feedback loop that you're really explicitly focusing on so that predictability from the individual becomes better. But I agree, it applies very differently based on the company type and how you're shipping software.
So you said earlier that you had 15% of the time set aside for ideas from engineering, and then another 15% of the time set aside for architectural hygiene. I assume you also set aside time for bug fixing. So did you actually manage to convince your product managers that they only had 50% of the capacity or something like this?
Yeah, I mean, it ended up being, we actually put ongoing supportability was always a product manager owned piece. And under that, we would put tools like the typical tools you all would do for making things diagnosable in the field and sort of the RAS features. So that was actually explicitly a product manager for us, owned all of that, and that would include some notion of which bugs should be fixed. So they considered that part of the feature thing. But we were enterprise software, and so a lot of it was on just rock solid stability, and so that became probably a bigger deal. But I would say, to sit up here and naively say I could just take 30 to 40% of a release capacity out and not have people complain would not be true. There was a lot of fighting, and ultimately the view was that the long-term productivity was important, and that retaining and having effective engineers was extremely important, and so that took a lot of CEO level support for doing that. So it's a fight, and you have to prove that it's worth it. On the flip side, I would just say, especially on architectural hygiene, when you start tying the bugs that are happening into that cruddy code, I got the product managers to really buy into it, and they actually themselves went through rotation so that they were sort of in charge of the architectural hygiene bucket when release and then switching. And they kind of thought it was cool that they could hang out with the engineering team, and we kind of got more of the folks around it at that time.
What are the ways you deal with people who tend to over-engineer or overthink problems?
The question was, what are some techniques for dealing with people that tend to over-engineer or overthink problems?
I could also add people who are, I would call brilliant or close to it, but they just tend to overthink things.
Yeah, so if you remember the scientific graph, there was a navel-gazing continuum. So we, maybe just throw in one master level content that did this. So again, this is as the engineering team got super, super large. Maybe some of you have explicit technical ladders today, some of you don't. But we actually very much used the promotion process to really communicate and measure and really show people what we valued as a company. And so this is a simplified example, but amount of code deleted actually became one of the bigger factors that we would actually call out as they would do it. And amount of code generated became a very specific one. We probably had the problem that there were not enough people doing the longer term architectural analysis in that case. But the only specific thing I would say we did is make it very obvious, both explicitly in promotion analysis as well as who we put into the most promoted positions, that productivity and shipping code matters. So they had to fit here, somewhere between those two.
Thank you.
You were discussing regarding the person, the stinky order guy and the other guy where they had the attitude problem. So how would you kind of say, okay, now I'm going to put my stuff down and this is it, basically. How do you go about it? How do you kind of lay those terms down, you kind of have one-on-ones with them, you kind of talk indirectly? How do you go?
I would just say two specific things. Again, I don't like talking about the BO one so much. That person got their own office. It was a simple fix. Although then a lot of people showed up and started smelling themselves so that they might get their own office, I guess. So that is a good trick, perhaps, if you want more space. But in the latter case, this is the hardest thing in management, is when you have to talk to a productive person and tell them you're doing something very, very damaging. I probably did a couple different things. So I explicitly had a tech lead for each group that I was managing. It was an engineer, and they didn't have direct people responsibilities, but I empowered them quite a bit, and I also included them quite a bit. So I don't know if this was particularly effective or how it would work at your organizations, but I had the super hard conversation of, hey, you're pissing everybody off. Here's two people that have now quit because of you. We're done with this. We're not going to allow it to happen anymore. Here is this guy, John, who's also going to tell you how he sees it as one of the senior most respected people in the organization. And he would give a very engineering-centric view of the world on, hey, you can't rewrite people's code and check it in. That's terrible. And that way we had two people in the room, which I think is always important to pull off when you can. And it sucks. It's really hard, but you draw the line and then you have to stick with it, and people will talk and they'll know that.
Did you ever have the fear of losing him?
A
fear of losing the person? He's going to quit the job and lose
again, all of you have probably had different flavors of this. Usually they don't make it. Just by the time that it's gotten to you and you're having to have that conversation, my experience is that less than half of the time does it actually get corrected. But I'd like to think it's a lot more than that. But again, these are probably the extreme cases that I was having to deal with, where literally multiple people had quit because of this person. It became pretty straightforward. But
Thank you.
It's hard. There's no question.
All right, so one last question and then we'll move forward.
So, you mentioned adding a lot of interns. Do you have any tips on how to hire them, skills?
Oh yeah, the question was how do you hire 450 interns? Or just good tricks for it. You know, at the end of the day, it's probably the most obvious thing on earth, which is most engineers love going back to their alma mater. And so we would just pay for a nice trip for any engineer who wanted to go back to where they went to college and give them the right to hire 2 or 3 on-site, no one else getting involved. A relatively low overhead way to do it. They get hooked up with the Career Center or whomever else did it. But after that, it becomes super if you do a good job, it becomes very self-propagating and you get plenty of flow. But anyway, I think that's another way that every engineer loves going back and being post-graduated, sort of go talk about jobs and talk about their company. So I found it to be very, very good for development and morale at the same time. But yeah, they might make a bad hire multiple times, but it's not a huge bar. Good, well thanks very much. My last name's Herrod at everything Gmail or something if you ever have any questions or just want to chat. So thanks for the time.
All right, thank you.